Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I am very happy to welcome back to this radio program journalist Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi became well known for his reporting of the financial crisis in 2008 and the years following for Rolling Stone magazine, where he stayed for many years. Now he's working for himself with a new online subscription-based Substack. He has written several books, including Insane Clown President, The Divide, Griftopia, The Great Derangement, and Hate Inc. His latest book, now out, is called The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, an almost true account. It is co-written by an anonymous collaborator, and it's about one man's experience in dealing drugs. Matt Taibbi joins me via Zoom. Matt, thank you so much for taking time to join me today.
No, thank you for having me, Mitch.
As a professional, at least I like to consider myself a professional interviewer, I prize myself on never beginning an interview by asking about the title of a book. But I do feel a bit compelled to ask about at least the subtitle of your book, an almost true account. What does that mean?
So the genesis of this book is that somebody I had met in my let's just say a different professional capacity, who I knew for a long time and in another field, suddenly came out to me that he was a fairly high-level drug dealer. And we had this long discussion, and we both decided that the details of his life would make a great story. However, we didn't want to make it nonfiction because, well, for a variety of reasons. There were some liability issues. There were some criminal liability issues involving the author that we might have had to worry about. So what we basically did is take the shell of a whole lot of real experiences and create a fictionalized kind of like sort of pulp noir detective story around it. A lot of the stuff in there are elements that are true, but we basically turned it into a novel.
Wow, that just invokes so many questions, right at the beginning. And you said from a previous professional endeavor that you were involved in, and you said he came out to you as having dealt drugs. So I guess that assumes you were not involved in that business.
No, I wasn't. And not only that, I had no idea, and I knew this person pretty well. So that speaks a little bit to the the professionalism of this person. And that's one of the things I tried to convey, or we tried to convey actually in the writing of this book, which was this is an extremely careful person who sort of researched what it would take to become a successful drug dealer, stay out of jail. And he was really dedicated to the craft of that. And the book is framed around a whole series of rules he had spent his lifetime accumulating, and he follows those religiously. And that's one of the reasons why people like me who were really close to him had no clue that any of this was going on.
Well, that's interesting. And the character in the book, and this is not the real name, is Huey Carmichael. And my sense is that that's a combination of Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael, but correct me if I'm wrong. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And one of the rules that you're talking about is to always have a quote unquote legitimate job.
Yeah. So and the discipline of that is incredible because, and there are a lot of sort of sub rules that are associated with that. Like, oh, he's dressed like an Applebee's waiter. Like, part of the reason that he does that is because of the obvious reason that a person who has a square job is going to deflect, the attention of any authorities. Like if you're not doing anything and you're walking around with gold chains and in a hot car, then somebody's going to take an interest in you. If you drive a Nissan Sentra and you go to work as a waiter at a chain restaurant, probably not. You're not going to get that attention. But that's actually not the primary reason that he does it. It's more about the psychological discipline of having a regular job. And this is interesting to me as a journalist because I think there are lessons in it for reporters too, which is, in his mind, if you can stand dealing with people, for instance, at a waiting tables at a chain restaurant, or being the manager in a hotel in a night shift or something like that, then you can handle a stressful situation with the police. You're not going to lose your cool in a car stop. And you sort of stay in touch with what life is about for most ordinary people. Like, your head isn't in the clouds. You're focused on mundane day-to-day details, and that keeps you sharp. So this is why he had that rule. I think that's fascinating. I was really interested in that idea of his, because I think if more people thought that way, they would. It would probably be an interesting lesson for people in a lot of different fields.
Matt, over the years, you've done a lot of writing and have written many books about the financial world. Do you see a parallel to the reporting that you've done over the years concerning the financial world, and this story that you're telling now about drug dealing?
Well, it's a very different kind of writing. First of all, this is the first book that I've done that had any kind of fictional element in it, and it's a different kind of storytelling, because I was much more concerned with things like pace and dialogue, and maybe even humor and things like that than I would be in another kind of journalism. In terms of the stories themselves, this character Huey, he's open about the fact that this is a story about American capitalism, essentially, and about what you can get away with, and what the difference between legal and illegal is. And I think there are some interesting parallels there, actually. There's a section in this book where essentially a bunch of people who are used to be illegal growers are getting together and talking about lobbying to make themselves street legal. And that's exactly what goes on a lot in the financial services industry. There are things that simply don't exist, right? There are practices, there are new financial instruments, new financial techniques, and they're not covered by law initially. They might be illegal, like somebody might interpret them as illegal if some financial authority were to pay attention. But what often happens is, a bank or a series of banks will get together and they will lobby the appropriate authorities to, say, lift the leverage ratio limits, right? And that's what happened before 2008. They got together and made it legal to borrow more money than banks were previously allowed to borrow, and that made it legal, right? So there's an interesting sort of comparison here about the difference between crime and not crime. It's not inherent. It has to do with just how much influence you can win over, which people and a lot of that also has to do with financial muscle, as it turns out. If you have enough money to get the ear of the right authorities, then you can go from being a criminal to being a business person.
Is there a big difference between being one that is seen as legitimate and the other non-legitimate? And of course, that's changing right now in the world that we live in when it comes to at least marijuana. But a difference between what we consider to be normal finance and something that might be more under the table with drug dealing?
Well, look, there are so many parallels in finance to the kind of subterranean business that drug dealing is, right? Like, if you think about things like dark pools, or even a lot of the new bit-based businesses, again, a lot of this is just people in the financial services industry striking out on their own and saying, well, we're going to do this thing. There's no law that governs it until they tell us to stop. We're just going to do it. And sometimes that can have positive effects that can lead to creating capital for all kinds of interesting businesses. And sometimes that can be devastating, as we found out in 2008, when, among other things, for instance, they completely changed the mortgage registry rules, right? They went from being a paper-based system to an electronic system. They did that kind of without regulatory authority. And that ended up being an enormous mess because nobody knew who owned anybody's properties when these mortgages started failing. So yeah, there are some parallels. I think there are sort of dark spots in the finance world that that have yet to be illuminated by the law or by the authorities.
Again, because of your book's a novel, The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, I'll do my very best not to give away the plot in the course of our conversation. But there is another parallel that I found very interesting that I think is something that we're observing happening right now. And that is, as we see the country moving towards legalization of recreational marijuana, not there on the federal level yet, but many states are moving towards there. We're seeing the big agricultural industry get in on this. Talk to me about how you write about that and compare and contrast what we're really seeing out there.
Well, again, this character, one of the things that he was interested, one of the reasons that he wanted to do this book is that he was interested in highlighting a problem that he saw coming, which was all the people who'd been doing this business for years were about to be crowded out. And there was going to be a new power that was going to move in, that was going to be financed by all the biggest banks in the country. And essentially they were going to buy themselves regulatory exclusivity to take over this industry. They were going to buy up all the farm property. They were going to try to pass laws that made sure that people who had felony drug dealing records couldn't participate in the new business. So sort of anti-competitive, anti-capitalist behavior, right? But that's what America's all about, actually. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it has a lot less to do with the sort of Adam Smith ideal of competition and capitalism than it does with just power and influence. It's the same thing as street dealing, except probably just no guns, right?
Territorial, right?
It's very territorial, right? And he saw this coming early, and that's part of the story, which is, this idea of we got to organize and do something because otherwise we're going to be pushed out by these people, and that is a subplot of the book.
Of organizing, trying to I have friends who sell marijuana in California, and this is what I've heard from them, that they're once marijuana became recreationally legal, they became very worried about their future to be able to stay in this business.
Right, because all of a sudden there are all these variables in play that they didn't have to worry about previously. You start to think about, well, who's judging what's a legal business and what isn't? Who has the financial power to buy up all the distribution routes? Who's going to govern and regulate the industry? All of these things are things that they didn't have to think about previously. And once it became apparent that companies like the biggest investment banks in the country were going to have an interest in financing some of these firms, that's when they started to get worried, because a lot of these dealers have made a lot of money over time, but it's nothing like the money that they'd be going up against if this were to be completely legalized.
And also the connections that big agricultural companies already have politically, and the power that they already have.
Right. Yeah. I mean, agribusiness already has long-standing connections and techniques for getting regulations passed. And these people don't. But by definition, they've been staying under the radar. They've been avoiding those kinds of connections. They haven't wanted anything to do with the state. So they're at an automatic disadvantage with that kind of crossover to a new legalized system.
How much is this happening right now? Is this something that you've paid any attention to journalistically?
A little bit. I mean, I think it's still happening. It's still a state by state affair. I think in different states there are different issues. There are different issues with different substances. there are a lot of things, mushrooms are still very much in a gray area. The internet complicates things because there are a lot of things that can be delivered that some people claim are legal and some people will claim aren't legal. And, a lot of it is still kind of a gray area. But the old fashioned, marijuana dealer, grower and seller of marijuana, like, that person, he just has to be prepared for, he or she has to be prepared for entering a new era of this business. It's just not going to be the same as it was in the 80s and 90s.
The character in your novel is African American. I'm assuming that your source is actually African American as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How did race play into this story that you told?
Well, it figures in a million ways. This character, both the actual co-author and the character Huey Carmichael, who are similar but not exactly the same, incidentally. Huey's a lot more, the character is a lot more humorless than the actual person, who's a pretty funny guy, I would say. But Huey Carmichael is he's a calculating, intelligent businessman, and he sees race both in a way that makes him angry as an African American citizen, but he also sees it as an opportunity from a business perspective. He uses race as a way to get away with things. He uses it, the expected racism of police officers and law enforcement authorities in a way, to his advantage. Like, for instance, he has a whole rule about how you do a highway convoy, like a delivery route, where you have 4 cars, and the guy in the first car is basically a stereotype of the African American criminal, right? You have that person dress up in a certain way, wear gold chains, blast rap music, and that's the dummy car, right? Like that's the car that has nothing in it, and the actual load will be in a couple of cars back. But the whole point of that is to try to attract the police by playing on their stereotypes, their sensitivity to stereotypes. In a converse, again, the whole idea of dressing square, dressing like somebody who works in a chain restaurant, speaking in a certain way, like this is a character who grew up both in the suburbs and in the projects. Yeah, has kind of an interesting background that way. Parents split, so he came from both worlds. It's a little bit like that series. I'm blanking on the name of it. Is it Snowball? Snowball, I think, is the one. And in LA, it's a person who comes from both worlds, and so the idea of dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, that just throws the police off. I think the line in the book is that when a black man can put a sentence together, it throws the police off. So he's constantly using race and racism to his advantage professionally. But also, it's inherently a disadvantage for him because he can't personally do a lot of the runs and that sort of thing. But it's a big theme.
I suspect a big part of actually being a successful drug dealer is not being obvious about being a drug dealer.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And also being very, very sensitive to the danger that lurks all around you at all times. I think, lessons of a lot of the people in the book who do get caught or do get in trouble is that they let their guard up, all the time. Huey has all kinds of rules, like never say anything you wouldn't, or never write anything on paper that you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the New York Times, right? You have to be paying attention constantly to the image that you're projecting, to the things that you're saying. and you want to blend in. Never drive a car that's going to attract attention. You always drive boring cars. Like it's the sort of counter stereotype. And he actually, interestingly, he learned a lot of this from movies about drugs and drug dealing, like Paid in Full, which has a character who thinks very much the same way. There's a Wood Harris character who has a lot of the same lessons. He delivers dry cleaning for a living, doesn't give up the job, right? Because that's part of the disguise. But that was also part of the motivation for this book, is that he didn't have a place to go to look for all these rules in one place. The only place he could learn was the movies, and he thought the movies were imperfect as a tool for how to do this kind of thing.
Have you written Matt Taibbi? Have you written a novel before? And did you always know that you would write a novel? Have you had aspirations of writing novels, or do you have aspirations of writing more novels?
I do and did. In fact, I never wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be a novelist. I was desperate not to be a journalist, actually. And the problem for me was that when I first started writing, it turned out that I lack certain really key details that novelists need. Specifically the ability to invent dialogue and situations. There's a lot of other stuff I can do pretty well. I mean, if you read my other books, you can see that I've spent a lot of time working on the craft of writing, right? But it turned out I just don't have the talent for it. This is a different kind of endeavor. This is a kind of quasi-journalistic type of novel writing, which I think is new and interesting. I would love to do it again. I thought a lot about books like In Cold Blood, oddly enough, when I started writing this with our co-author, because the technique there was similar, right? Like the idea was you do interviews over and over and over again of people in real life situations, and then you start at the beginning and you write it like a novel, like you use the real details that you've gathered. But you put it together the way a novelist would do it. So that was new for me. That was really, really fun. I mean, I really enjoyed doing it. And honestly, this is my favorite book of the books that I've written.
It's your favorite book?
The favorite book.
Because you have some great books.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are some of the nonfiction books are I think they're good. But this one is fun in a way, and writing wise, it moves forward in a way that the other ones don't. So I was really happy with this book. I'm usually miserable after a book is out, so this one was different.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with journalist Matt Taibbi. I guess I should also say novelist as well. Matt Taibbi now writes at Substack, where it's a subscription-based online web service. We're going to talk more about that. He's the author of a number of books. This latest book, which is a novel, is called The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, an Almost True Account. And again, it is an almost true account, just not quite. This book was first published actually by Substack. We all learned about your writings, Matt, during your years with the Rolling Stone magazine. Is this something you could have written with Rolling Stone, being at Rolling Stone?
No, I don't think so. I don't. Rolling Stone has serialized a few things in their past, but I don't think this would be something that they would have done. It's a whole book. It's a big bite for a mainstream magazine to take on, and we had no idea. Like I don't have any track record as a fiction writer. It would be unusual for somebody to do like a Bonfire of the Vanities type project for somebody who'd never written a novel before. So it's not like they were inherently against it, but we just didn't even talk about it. And this was something that came up as an opportunity because I had just started to work with this new company at the time, a new company called Substack, and the only room that I could see contractually for me to do online work for another company was if I wrote a book. So rather than having a series of op-ed articles, which is what I do now, or journalistic articles, we decided that I would serialize a book online at Substack, and that's how it got that process happened.
So it started as a serial novel, and then and now it's being published by OR Books as an actual physical novel that you can possess.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about Substack? I think we've all heard of Substack by now. Probably not everyone has subscribed to it yet. It is a subscription-based website. You can get a year subscription, I guess, of one writer, but you'll correct me on this, for $50 a year.
Yeah, so it varies from writer to writer. Some of it's interesting. Some of the sites, individual sites on Substack, are not just one writer. Like they're actually more like traditional, web or news organizations like Salon.com.
But on Substack, that's interesting.
But on Substack, so there's for instance, there's a site called The Bulwark, which is actually believe it or not, the reconstituted Hulk of the Weekly Standard. But politically, Substack is all over the place. Most of the people probably lean in the other direction, I would say.
But the other direction meaning
more to the left, I would say. Mm-hmm. It's hard to say. On Substack, there are so many different sites about so many different things, and all it is a payment mechanism and a platform that you can use, and you're responsible for your own marketing. But it does put together the material in a certain way that's clean and easy and user friendly. But Substack has become this place where a lot of people who have been either squeezed out of conventional journalism for one reason or another, or who had, objections to what was going on in their newsrooms. They've moved over to this platform. They've set up their own, sort of hung their own shingles, and started their own businesses. And it works very much like Patreon, but it's become it's been very, very interesting. As a journalistic phenomenon, it's interesting because previously there was never really a big space, I guess, except for podcasts, for people who didn't fit into kind of the big commercial media. There was not a lot of room in alternative media left in the internet age. I mean, as you know, things have been getting squeezed continually for decades now. Local news has been getting hammered. Newspapers are shutting down all over the place. But Substack financially does quite well. This new model where people kind of pay directly for the writers that they like. I don't think it solves a lot of problems for journalism because it doesn't pay for things like great investigative journalism or foreign reporting. But it is interesting because it's a new space that is, unlike almost everything else in journalism, not failing. So that's interesting.
I think many of us first learned about Substack when Glenn Greenwald went to Substack after he had his blow up with the Intercept. Mm-hmm. One of the critiques about Substack is that, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I guess if you work for a particular news program on Substack, you might have editors. But do you just work alone? And is there a concern about sort of losing any kind of oversight, another pair of eyes as an editor to over your work?
So that was I would say a bigger issue at the beginning of this process. Most of the people who've done well at Substack have already advanced to the point where they've hired people to take on some of those tasks. I don't have a traditional editor, but there are people that I have like one person who's full-time staff, and then I have a series of people who I'm now able to bring in as consultants for various things. Sometimes I hire proofreaders, sometimes I hire fact checkers. And I think that's in the future of, a lot of people on Substack. I mean, the business really just got off the ground last year in a big way when people like myself and Glenn and, Matt Iglesias, Andrew Sullivan, a few other people started moving there. But so it was in its earliest stages. It started to bring in enough revenue that we can start paying for some of those other things that incidentally were disappearing from conventional journalism. And I think that's one of the things that the ironies that I find about that criticism, because I watched that process over 30 years. Once newspapers started to lose money, the first people to go were the fact checkers. The second were the sub editors. The people. It was usually just one big editor doing the work, as opposed to a whole team of people. Investigative journalism, they weren't paying for those stories anymore. So, yes, a lot of the structure that typically is present in big organizations wasn't there at the start, but I think it will be.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you find those same dynamics other more traditional news outlets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think the arrows are kind of going in opposite directions with traditional news and Substack, whereas Substack is, I think, staffing up, and traditional news is staffing down. So we'll see. We'll see how it happens. People do things in different ways on the site. Some of us don't have editors or don't have co-authors, don't have other regular contributors. Some do. Some don't have proofreaders, some do. So it's an individual choice. I'm kind of a mixture. I do hire some people, and I do have some other contributors, but yeah, we'll see how it works.
You have a lifelong relationship to the news, and I say that because your father was a broadcast journalist himself, I think, for NBC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For Dateline, for years. For ABC News once upon a time.
What do you think the state of journalism is today in its entirety? And I don't mean just traditional news, but I mean just our big milieu of news in the world.
A mess. I think commercial media is at maybe the lowest low point in my lifetime. I think if you look at the statistics and the poll numbers, you'll see that the public trust in the news media has never been at a lower point. And yes, it's skewed. I think if you ask Republicans, that they're almost universally distrustful of the media, but the numbers are not great on the other side either. They're getting worse over there as well. To me, I think this is an accumulation of years of mistrust that has come from failure within our business. I started to see this in the early 2000s after the WMD episode. For the first time when I would cover things like the presidential campaign, I get people yelling at me about working in the news media and what a dishonest profession it was. And then, it was steadily from there. It was like little things here and there. It was mistakes that didn't get corrected, or that people were noticing the practice of silent edits at newspapers, right? Like, this is a thing that happens in the internet age. Rather than announce that you've made a mistake, they'll just fix it. And you have to go to the Wayback Machine to see what the original text was. And that arouses distrust, and people making mistakes about, this or that story arouses distrust. So
this is, if I could just chime in here, this is a big deal, I think, with the internet age of news, because we all remember back in the day going through a newspaper, and always the second page, or somewhere in the paper, in that front section, there would be a section dedicated to correcting mistakes. So you could read it, you could see it. But that's no longer, if it is there, I've never seen it.
Yeah, they still do it. A couple of papers still do it, but it's never completely thorough. And on some of the more important stories, they won't tell you that they've made a change, and which I think is totally unethical. I mean, you should always let people know. It stings a little to have to put that, little asterisk in the middle of the piece and at the bottom say an earlier version of the story said X, Y, and Z, but we screwed that up, so now it says this.
And some of the major outlets do that. I think you'll find that like at the New York Times.
You will, but the Times also does silent edits. I found them, and it's noticeable because people are now looking for it. They've become much more media savvy than they were in the past. And this is another thing that I noticed in the last 15, 20 years is that once there started to be resentment towards the media, people started to learn about how the business actually works. So now they're looking and they're conscious of things like who our advertisers are, what kind of stories we're doing, and whether we're avoiding certain topics because we're getting advertising money from this sector or that sector. They're looking to see whether we're using old footage or new footage, or old photos or new photos, who the quotes are from, whether the sources are named or unnamed. Like they're wise to all this stuff in ways that they used to not be. And I think that's good overall, but the problem is we haven't collectively as a business met that challenge very well. And as a result, we've had this collapse of trust in the news media, which is an enormous problem for the country, as we've seen specifically with the pandemic story, where you desperately need people to trust the media, and also to be able to use the media to get information, and they don't, which is a massive issue.
Do you think it's the media that is driving the politics of division and mistrust, or is it mirroring what's happening largely in society? Or I mean, I imagine it could be both ways too.
I think it's certainly a little bit of both, but I would. I wrote the book Hate Inc. The whole premise of it was that our financial model in the internet age is based on the idea of siloing audiences and capturing and dominating certain demographics by feeding them news that we know that they're going to agree with ahead of time. And so we're financially motivated to divide people because the model for station A is going to be, let's tell everybody in this group a whole bunch of stuff that they're going to like, which typically is bad news about group B over here, who has and those people have their own station. And that's how you get the kind of Fox MSNBC divide, where people all day long, are scrolling through their phones and they're hearing negative information about some other group because that's the easiest way to sell the business. I think that more than anything is responsible for the division, because if you go back and this wasn't an ethical thing, this was a commercial thing, but once upon a time, the business model for news was the Walter Cronkite news broadcast, which was designed to be consumed by people across the political spectrum. Like it was the kid in the Shea t-shirt and the old right-wing uncle were at the dinner table watching the news together because it was kind of watered down in a way that was inoffensive for everybody. Well, we don't do that anymore. We now have news for the uncle and news for the kid in the Shea t-shirt, and they're on different channels and they're being advertised to by different sponsors, and that's where you get the division. Yeah,
they're also watching different devices. Back in the day, you had one TV in the room.
That's true. Yeah, it's amazing that we can remember that. But that's not true anymore either.
And we, at the time, hated the Walter Cronkite. And I don't mean this directly at Walter Cronkite. He's remembered as this legendary newsman. But at the time, that model, we hated that model at the time. If you didn't fit within sort of the mainstream, because we thought all you saw was what could fix what the narrative was, whatever was created by this one source, and you never got outside of it, and it helped just perpetuate the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of modeled my whole career after reporters who had taken the opposite approach to that, right? Like people like Terry Southern, Hunter Thompson, like this very individualized, opinionated kind of narrative journalism. However, looking back, I do see that we've lost something in abandoning the quote unquote objective model of journalism, which Cronkite symbolized. And it wasn't just Cronkite; it was basically every newspaper in the country. That kind of dull third person, emotionally neutral voice that everybody that was basically every news story. That was the dominant model for reporting the news once upon a time, and people trusted it in a way that they don't trust the news today, because they did not perceive the news to be politicized. Now, it was obviously heavily politicized, and if you read people like Noam Chomsky and books like Manufacturing Consent, what they say is basically you were getting a sanitized version of the news where certain kinds of information were being sort of pre-edited out of the landscape. It was deceptive in that way. However, it did have the effect of inspiring a certain kind of confidence among audiences that modern news does not. Now everybody is conscious that most news is politicized, and heavily so, and so they don't trust it. I think even the viewers of Fox News don't really trust Fox News.
You don't think so?
And no, I think we saw that with the Trump phenomenon. Like, when Trump came up, if you remember, there was this huge thing in the National Review where like 20 of the biggest right-wing media figures basically said, we can't do this. Let's stop and think about it. And it landed like with the weight of a feather. Like it had absolutely no impact. Fox was initially not on board with Trump. It was antagonistic to him. So I think what you see in those cases is that, yes, your audience might gobble up the stuff that you give them over time if you're feeding them just what they want to hear, but subconsciously the message they're going to get is like, these people aren't really worth trusting. They're manipulating me for money, and I'm going along with it, but it's not like it's a voice I'm going to respect in a key moment. I think that's very true of news generally now. Like even people who watch it a lot, I think they don't respect it a lot.
I do watch a lot of cable news, including Fox, because I think it's important to watch it. And it's always interesting when you hear people on the left criticize Fox, or you hear people on the right criticize more liberal outlets. You're always hearing from people that usually don't watch the other one.
Right.
And
exactly.
if you're not watching that one, you'll get a perception of that's only according to someone who doesn't like it, which is interesting. But it does seem like, and I think this is happening on all sides. I think I agree with you largely on this. But it seems like when we get to the business model of this, it's as though outrage pays. It's the news of the outrage, or the politics of outrage. And it's not just the cable news companies. It's also just regular people on social media. The more edgy and outraged you are on a social media post, the more attention you get on that social media post, rather than and I've tried, and I could be biased here, but I've tried to put out a sober, reasoned, measured statement, and it's just crickets when I do that, put something out there, it's a little edgy and angry, and it starts to move. It starts to go. It reminds me, Matt Taibbi, do you remember the movie 1984 that was made in 1984 with William Hurt? It's a great, I think it's the best movie of 1984. And this is in the book too, But in the movie, they have that scene of it's like 2 minutes of hate or something. I could get this a little bit wrong. And they put
I just made that comparison last week, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, they put an image of the guy you're supposed to hate, who you've been told you're supposed to hate, and then everyone just starts screaming and yelling at the screen for the next few minutes. That's what I think of when I think of the media landscape today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was the whole premise of the book Hate Inc. And I came to that place because I realized that I had been complicit in some of that. You know, I spent a lot of time, especially in the Rolling Stone years, kind of throwing red meat to audiences. And I did, you know, it's hard not to do because the entire news landscape is work that being on liberal, and the same is true on the other side. Like if you worked in almost anywhere else in the Trump years, if you weren't writing negative stuff about Trump, it wasn't going to make money. Like that's what everybody did for money. And yeah, I mean, like I think the change has been dramatic. Years ago, I mean, 10 years ago in my career, I was doing 5,000 word, 6,000 word features about credit default swaps and how they worked, right? So it reported investigative type journalism, and you tried to make it the writing fun, but still it's still very much what you people would call eat your vegetables journalism, right? Like, you know, you're trying to teach somebody something that's important and socially beneficial, all that stuff. At that time, there was still a market for that. Like audiences still reacted to that. Today, I don't see that thing. Like, the New York Times did a 30,000 word on Donald Trump finances, and it was in the cycle for about minutes. You know, I mean, it just doesn't. You know, tweets get more response than heavily reported investigative journalism does now, in some cases, which is really disheartening.
I'm going to follow up a little bit of what you just said there, only because we're having some internet connections, and there's a few times there you dropped out, and I thought it was important when you were starting to explain that you've even have to go back and look at your own reporting, and I feel this way too, and I think this is something we should all be doing as a media and observing, sort of like, and being open to what we've done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I look back at some of the stuff that I did in the last 20 years, and I could see that I had on more than one occasion resorted to, you know, cliches about. Look, there's a cliche that's very, very consistent in kind of New York, Washington, LA, sort of left-leaning journalism, where the wisecracking, well-educated narrative writer goes to the sticks and makes a whole bunch of jokes about the right-wing hayseeds who don't really know what they're doing, you know. And I did do a number of those stories, you know, a lot of it was cliche written, and I knew you knew back at the time that that kind of stuff was going to fly with your own audience, and that the people you were writing about would probably never even see it, and I had a lot of
sounds like you work at Pacifica Radio, man.
Yeah,
and you know, I thought there was value to that, to be frank, because this is a period of time when just, again, a few cable news companies, a few newspapers, maybe a few radio stations were controlling the narrative. I think there was value to coming outside of the box and you know, doing some of what has been done before, but now everyone seems to be tailoring their news towards an audience, and that seems to be a problem.
It's a massive problem. I remember, you know, I lived overseas for about a dozen years or so. I was in the former Soviet Union for a long time, and when I came back, I remember going to a Barnes and Noble and going to the political book area, and there's one shelf for right-wing authors, and then there's another shelf for sort of blue leaning authors, and you can even see from the fonts were different, right? Like the Democratic friendly books were more blue, these ones were more red and shiny. And I thought to myself at the time, that's so weird. Like, what writer automatically wants to forego half the audience? It doesn't make any sense, right? Why would you want to do that? But that's what we do in this country. We don't write for everybody. We don't even try. We mostly identify a demographic that we think is going to like what we're going to tell them, and we write for those people and nobody else. And it's that siloing process that I think has become really insidious. Like I think it's important for people throughout journalism to try to break out of that, to occasionally try to talk to the other people, who aren't their regular audience, because that's when you get lazy, that's when you make mistakes, and that's when you resort to cliches that may be harmful or even incorrect. And absolutely, that's a big problem.
And again, I think there was value to it, right? I mean, because there was a time that there was no one writing to a particular audience who didn't feel like that they had a voice, or activists who felt like no one would cover them. I think about where I worked, Pacifica Radio, during the War on Terror, especially the early years. There was really no one else, at least in broadcast media, that would have dissent and allow people to express dissent during those years. So I think it definitely had value. And then I wonder, am I just getting old? Am I, longing for? I mean, I'm going to be 50 here pretty soon, and maybe I'm struggling with keeping up with the times.
Well, I think you make a good point. Like it was important once upon a time for there to be a place for, for news for an audience that was being deprived elsewhere. I mean, the time period you referenced, remember, they fired Phil Donahue from MSNBC, and they unhired Jesse Ventura because they mistakenly thought he was pro-war at that time. He ended up buying a house in Mexico with the proceeds of that contract that he still calls Casa MSNBC. But yeah, no, there was no place. If you were anti-war back then, there was a handful of outlets, and mostly it was on the fringes of alternative media for the most part. So I think you're right. There was tremendous value in there being a safe haven for those audiences. The problem is when you get stuck only talking to that one group of people over and over again for years and years and years. I think that's when you start to have a problem, because ultimately we should be trying to appeal to everybody, or at least have a dialogue with everybody, and we don't really do that now.
And it results in the politics of this. I mean, we right now have a political system that is ruled by two parties that we used to complain were one and the same. Some still might, but at the same time, basically see each other as existential threats to the country.
Right, and to me, again, this is part of the feature of the media issue, because ironically, and this is such a comeback, it's a little bit like the drug dealing business. In order to continually make money selling divisive media, you have to keep continually upping the ante. It's just like drugs. There's a law of diminishing returns. The thing that had shock value yesterday is kind of humdrum today. So you have to keep amping up the sort of anguish, anxiety, rage, upset. All those things have to be cranked up more than they were yesterday. So audiences that were a little bit angry about, those other people 4 or 5 years ago, well, after steadily scrolling through hundreds and hundreds of news stories for a period of years, they're going to get to the point where they're radicalized eventually. And, I talked to people like Chris Hedges about this, and, he used to work in Yugoslavia, where, you had the same kind of issue, literally balkanized media there. And you're talking to where media was talking to only certain subgroups, and they're all angry and they all have guns, and eventually it leads to a very, very dark place. And I think that's what's happening in media in America now.
You were once a darling on the American left. Many in the left still have a high sense of regard for you, but you've also become more controversial in recent years.
Yeah, and this is a source of frustration to me because first of all, I was never particularly public about my politics, but the thing that got me in trouble in the last 4 or 5 years with people, the quote unquote left, really most of these things were not ideological issues, except for the one big one, which is censorship. Very anti-censorship. I was one of the first reporters to really spend a lot of time on the issue of companies like Facebook and Google cracking down on speech. And I was very worried about that. I was very worried about the relationship between those companies and the Senate, which was putting a lot of pressure on them. To me, there starts to be a First Amendment issue when that comes into play. And I was very distressed by the lack of response from colleagues in the media who, I grew up, one of my first jobs was working at the Village Voice in an office that was 5 feet away from Nat Hentoff, who was like the great free speech defender in print media at the time. That's gone now from that sensibility is gone from the media at this point. That's been distressing to me. And then there's other things where I just felt like we're over reporting or making mistakes in reporting about things like Russiagate, right? And so people interpret that as, well, he's trying to defend Donald Trump. Well, no, I'm not. I can't stand Donald Trump. I wrote a book about him called Insane Clown President. I just don't think those stories are true. And I think when we get things wrong, we lose the confidence of the public. And so I spent time on that. So it's not about ideology for me. This is an issue about, I think it's a deeper issue about how we talk about and report the news. It's become much more of a rooting interest type of activity for a lot of people, whereas before reporters were mostly concerned about getting things right or wrong. Now I think there's a lot of, the main thing is whether I'm directionally right on what the material is. I just don't agree with that viewpoint, and that's gotten me. I think that's what's made me controversial a little bit.
Matt Taibbi has been our guest. Again, you can read Matt Taibbi's writings at his Substack website. He's also the author of a new novel just out. It's called The Business Secrets of Drug Dealing, an Almost True Story. Matt Taibbi, thank you.
Thanks so much, Mitch. All right, take care.